The morning mist clung to the suburban lawns of Millbrook, Connecticut like a gray shroud. Sarah Mitchell pulled her terry cloth robe tighter as she padded to the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand. The digital clock on the microwave read 5:47 a.m., too early for a Saturday, but insomnia had become her unwelcome companion since the divorce. Through the frost-kissed glass, she saw him. Ethan, her 8-year-old son, stood motionless in their backyard, bare feet pressed against the dew-soaked grass. His small frame was silhouetted against the pale dawn sky, pajama pants darkened with moisture at the cuffs. In his hands, he clutched something Sarah couldn't quite make out, dark, angular shapes that seemed to absorb the morning light. "Ethan!" she called softly, tapping the window. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the ground before him, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Sarah's heart quickened. Ever since the custody battle had intensified, Ethan had become increasingly withdrawn. His father, Marcus, claimed it was just a phase, but Sarah knew her son better than anyone. This wasn't normal childhood behavior. She slipped on her garden shoes and stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at her exposed skin. "Honey, what are you doing out here?" Ethan turned slowly, his usually bright brown eyes appearing distant, almost glassy. "They told me to plant them, Mom." His voice was barely above a whisper, carrying an odd cadence that made Sarah's stomach clench with unease. "Who told you, sweetheart?" He looked down at his hands, revealing 6 perfectly smooth, black stones. They weren't like anything Sarah had seen before, not river rocks or typical garden stones. These were geometric, almost crystalline in structure, with surfaces that seemed to shift and shimmer despite the overcast sky. "The voices," Ethan said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "They said the stones need to go in the ground. In a circle. They said it's important." Sarah knelt beside him, her maternal instincts overriding her confusion. "What voices, Ethan? When did you start hearing them?" But her son had already turned away, walking with deliberate steps toward the center of their yard. He began placing the stones in a precise pattern, each one positioned with mathematical accuracy that seemed impossible for a child his age. As Sarah watched, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. The stones seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and she could swear she heard something, a low, barely audible humming that made her teeth ache. "Ethan, stop. Come inside right now." But he couldn't hear her anymore. Or wouldn't. As he placed the final stone, the humming grew louder, and Sarah realized with growing horror that her son's lips were moving in perfect synchronization with the otherworldly sound. Dr. Amanda Chen had seen many things in her 15 years as a child psychiatrist, but the video Sarah Mitchell showed her was unlike anything in her experience. The security camera footage from the Mitchells' backyard showed Ethan standing motionless for nearly 2 hours, from 5:30 a.m. until sunrise, before suddenly springing into action to arrange the stones. "Has he done this before?" Dr. Chen asked, pausing the video at the moment when Ethan seemed to be listening to something. Sarah shook her head, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. "Never. He's always been such a normal kid. A little quiet since the divorce, but nothing like this." She gestured at the screen. "Look at how he moves. It's like he's programmed." Dr. Chen studied the footage more carefully. Ethan's movements were indeed unnaturally precise, each step measured and deliberate. What concerned her most was the child's posture, spine straight, head tilted at an exact angle, as if he were receiving instructions. "I'd like to speak with Ethan now," she said gently. "But first, tell me about these stones. Have you seen them before?" "That's the strange part," Sarah replied. "I've never seen anything like them. They're not from our yard, that's for sure. And when I tried to move them yesterday—" She paused, her voice catching. "It was like they were rooted to the ground." Ethan threw a complete tantrum, screaming that I was disrupting the pattern. Those were his exact words, disrupting the pattern. Dr. Chen made a note. And his father? What does Marcus think about this? Sarah's expression darkened. Marcus thinks I'm being overdramatic. He said boys collect rocks all the time, that I'm looking for problems that don't exist. But he hasn't seen what I've seen. He hasn't heard Ethan talking to himself in that language. Language. It's not English. It's not any language I've ever heard. It sounds almost mathematical, like he's reciting formulas or equations, but in sounds instead of numbers. When Ethan entered the office, Dr. Chen was struck by how ordinary he appeared. A typical 8-year-old with tousled brown hair and grass-stained sneakers. But his eyes held an intensity that seemed far too mature for his age. "Hello, Ethan. I'm Dr. Chen. Your mom brought you here so we could talk about the stones in your yard." The boy's demeanor shifted instantly. His shoulders straightened, and that same distant expression from the video clouded his features. "The pattern isn't complete yet," he said, his voice taking on that strange, hollow quality Sarah had described. 7 stones are required for the first phase. I only have 6. Who told you about the pattern, Ethan? The architects. The word came out with reverence, as if he were naming something sacred. They're waiting. They've been waiting for so long, and finally, someone can hear them properly. Dr. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. In all her years of practice, she'd never encountered anything quite like this. The boy's responses were too coherent to be simple fantasy, too specific to be random delusion. "Can you tell me more about the architects?" Ethan's eyes focused on something beyond the office walls. "They're not from here. They're from the between space, where the numbers live. They said the pattern will help them come home." As he spoke, Dr. Chen noticed something that made her breath catch. The boy's pupils were dilated, not from drugs or medical condition, but as if he were seeing something that required all his focus to perceive. And there, barely audible beneath his words, was that same humming sound Sarah had mentioned, coming from Ethan himself. Detective Ray Kowalski had been called to investigate stranger things than a kid with mysterious rocks, but not many. As he stood in the Mitchells' backyard, examining the 6 black stones arranged in their perfect circle, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the scene. "You said these appeared overnight?" he asked Sarah, who stood hugging herself despite the afternoon warmth. "That's right. Ethan was sleepwalking. At least, that's what I thought at first. But sleepwalkers don't usually carry out complex tasks like this." Kowalski knelt beside the stones, careful not to disturb them. Up close, they were even more unusual than Sarah had described. The surface wasn't quite solid. It seemed to shift and flow like liquid contained within an invisible shell. And the humming Sarah had mentioned was definitely real, a low frequency that seemed to resonate in his bones. "Have you had them analyzed?" "I tried. I took one to the geology department at the university. Professor Williams said he'd never seen anything like it. The density readings were impossible. Sometimes the scanners showed them as incredibly heavy, other times as having no mass at all." Kowalski frowned. "Where's that stone now?" Sarah's expression grew troubled. "That's the thing. When I came back to pick it up, it was gone. Professor Williams swore he'd locked it in his safe, but when he opened it, there was nothing inside. And Ethan, he knew it was missing before I even got home. He was waiting for me at the door, asking when I was going to bring his stone back." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Ethan appeared at the back door. But this wasn't the same boy who had sat in Dr. Chen's office. This Ethan moved with fluid grace, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden deck. "Detective," he said, his voice carrying that same eerie resonance, "you're disrupting the measurement." "Measurement of what, son?" Ethan stepped into the yard, and immediately the humming from the stones grew louder. "The dimensional frequency. The architects need precise calculations to complete the bridge." Kowalski felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "What kind of bridge?" The one that connects here to there. The one that lets them come home. Ethan's eyes reflected the light strangely, as if there were stars buried deep within them. They've been calling for so long, but humans couldn't hear them properly. Their minds are too linear. But you can hear them? I'm different, Ethan said simply. Mom doesn't understand. Dad doesn't understand. But you do, don't you, detective? You've seen things that don't fit in the normal world. Kowalski had indeed seen things, cases that defied explanation, evidence that seemed to bend the laws of physics. But he'd always found rational explanations eventually. This felt different. This felt like something beyond his ability to rationalize. What do they want, Ethan? The boy smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was ancient, knowing, and utterly alien. They want to come home, and I'm going to help them. Tonight, I find the seventh stone. Tonight, the pattern is complete. As Ethan spoke, the 6 stones began to glow with an inner light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The humming grew so loud that nearby windows began to vibrate, and Sarah stumbled backward, pressing her hands to her ears. "Ethan, stop!" she screamed. But her son was no longer listening to her. He was listening to something else entirely, something that spoke in frequencies only he could hear. And as the afternoon sun began to set, Kowalski realized with growing dread that they were running out of time. Professor Elena Vasquez had spent her career studying quantum mechanics and parallel dimensions, but nothing had prepared her for the call from Detective Kowalski. As she stood in the Mitchells' backyard that evening, her instruments detecting energy readings that should have been impossible, she finally understood why her research had led her to this small suburban town. "These aren't stones," she told the assembled group. Sarah, Detective Kowalski, and Dr. Chen, who had rushed over after receiving Sarah's frantic call. "They're some kind of trans-dimensional anchors. The energy signature is unlike anything I've ever recorded." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. "It means," Professor Vasquez said grimly, "that something is using these objects to create a bridge between our reality and somewhere else." Ethan sat on the back porch, seemingly oblivious to the adult conversation. But as Professor Vasquez spoke, his head tilted in that familiar listening pose, and his lips began moving in silent recitation. "The boy is connected to them," Dr. Chan observed. "Every time someone mentions the stones, he responds. It's as if he's receiving real-time updates." Professor Vasquez nodded. "I've been researching similar phenomena for years. There are documented cases of individuals who seem to act as conduits for extra-dimensional entities. Usually, they're dismissed as mentally ill, but the mathematical precision of these placements." She gestured at the stones. "This isn't random. This is sophisticated engineering." "Engineering for what?" Kowalski demanded. "A gateway. These entities, these architects, as Ethan calls them, they're not from another planet. They're from another dimension entirely. A place where the physical laws we understand don't apply." Sarah felt her world tilting. "And they're using my son?" "He's not just a conduit," Professor Vasquez explained gently. "He's the key. His neural patterns, his brain chemistry, something about him allows him to perceive and interact with their reality. They've been searching for someone like him for, well, possibly centuries." As if responding to her words, Ethan suddenly stood and walked toward them. But his movements were different now, more fluid, as if he were moving through water rather than air. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonic undertones that made the listener's bones vibrate. "Professor Vasquez," he said, though Sarah was certain she'd never told him the woman's name. "You understand the mathematics of folded space. You know that barriers between dimensions are not absolute." "I understand the theory," she replied carefully. "But the energy required to create a stable bridge would be enormous. It would require 7 focal points," Ethan interrupted. 7 stones arranged in a heptagonal pattern with precise angular measurements. The calculations are complex, but not impossible for those who exist in 11-dimensional space. Professor Vasquez stared at him in shock. How do you know about 11-dimensional theory? That's graduate-level physics. Ethan's smile was sad and ancient. I know because they know. And they know because they exist in all dimensions simultaneously. To them, the barriers between realities are just suggestions. The stones began to pulse more brightly, and the humming grew loud enough to rattle windows throughout the neighborhood. Dogs began barking in the distance, and Sarah noticed that the few visible stars seemed to be flickering erratically. "Ethan," she said desperately, "please, you're scaring me." Her son turned to her, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the boy she knew, confused, frightened, and very young. "I'm scared too, Mom, but I can't make them stop. They're so lonely, and they've been waiting so long. They just want to come home." "But this is their home," Dr. Chen said. "This is our reality." "No," Ethan replied, his voice growing distant again. "This is the shadow of their home. They were here first, before humans, before matter arranged itself into the patterns you call physics. They're not invaders, they're the original inhabitants, trying to return to a place that forgot them." As he spoke, the 7th stone began to materialize in his hands, forming from nothing more than crystallized air and starlight. The other 6 stones responded, their glow intensifying until the backyard was bathed in otherworldly light. "Tonight," Ethan whispered, "the pattern is complete. Tonight, the architects come home." The emergency had drawn more attention than Sarah had expected. By 10 p.m., her quiet suburban street was filled with police cars, government vehicles with tinted windows, and a hastily assembled team of scientists and military personnel. The house had been evacuated, but they could all see the pulsing light emanating from the backyard, growing stronger with each passing minute. Commander Patricia Hayes, a specialist in unexplained phenomena, stood in the command trailer they'd set up across the street. "Dr. Vasquez, what are we looking at here? Your report mentions dimensional breach." "The energy readings are off the charts," Professor Vasquez replied, her voice tight with tension. "The boy has placed the 7th stone, and the pattern is now generating a stable wormhole. We're looking at a possible incursion from what appears to be a higher dimensional reality." Sarah clutched Dr. Chen's arm. "Can't we just remove the stones? Break the pattern?" "We tried," Commander Hayes said grimly. 3 of my best men approached the perimeter 20 minutes ago. They couldn't get within 10 feet of the stones. Some kind of energy field repels all matter that wasn't part of the original configuration. Through the trailer's windows, they could see Ethan standing in the center of the stone circle. He was no longer moving like a normal child. His feet hovered inches above the ground, and his body seemed to be partially translucent, as if he were existing in multiple realities simultaneously. "He's becoming like them," Dr. Chen observed with growing horror. "The longer he remains connected to these entities, the more he transforms." "Is there a way to sever the connection?" Sarah asked desperately. Professor Vasquez studied her readings. "Theoretically, yes, but it would require precise timing and perfect coordination. The connection is maintained through quantum entanglement. If we could disrupt that entanglement at the exact moment when the bridge is most unstable." "When would that be?" "During the manifestation. When the architects begin to cross over, there will be a brief window, maybe seconds, when the dimensional barriers are at their weakest. If we could reach Ethan then, we might be able to break the connection." Commander Hayes shook her head. "My people can't get close enough. The energy field is too strong." "But I could," Sarah said quietly. "I'm his mother. The connection between us might be strong enough to overcome their influence." "Absolutely not," Dr. Chen protested. "The radiation levels alone could kill you. And if I don't try, what happens to my son? What happens to everyone? Sarah looked out at the backyard, where reality itself seemed to be bending around the stone circle. He's 8 years old. He doesn't understand what he's doing. He thinks he's helping lonely beings come home. As if responding to her words, the sky above the backyard began to change. The stars were no longer flickering. They were moving, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly. The fabric of space itself seemed to be tearing, revealing glimpses of something vast and alien beyond. The manifestation has begun, Professor Vasquez announced. We have maybe 10 minutes before the bridge stabilizes. After that, it may be impossible to close. Through the growing tear in reality, shapes began to emerge. They weren't quite physical, more like living geometries that existed in dimensions human eyes couldn't fully perceive. The architects were beautiful and terrible, beings of pure mathematics and crystallized thought. And at the center of it all, Ethan stood with his arms outstretched, welcoming them home. Sarah took a deep breath, pulling away from Dr. Chen's restraining grip. I'm going to get my son back.
Sarah, no.
But she was already running toward the house, toward the impossible light that surrounded her child, toward whatever lay beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The energy field around the stone circle felt like walking through liquid lightning. Sarah's skin tingled and burned as she forced herself forward, step by agonizing step. Behind her, she could hear Commander Hayes shouting orders, but the words seemed to come from very far away. "Ethan!" she called out, but her voice was absorbed by the dimensional distortion. Her son stood in the center of the circle, his body now completely translucent, his eyes reflecting the impossible geometries of the beings emerging from the tear in reality. The architects were magnificent and terrifying. They existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their forms shifting between mathematical concepts and crystalline structures. As they moved through the breach, Sarah felt their alien intelligence touch her mind, vast, ancient, and utterly inhuman. "Do not interfere," their collective voice resonated in her consciousness. "The child has chosen to serve as our anchor. Through him, we reclaim what was lost. He's just a boy." Sarah screamed, pushing deeper into the energy field. "He doesn't understand what you're asking of him." "Understanding is not required. Only connection. He will become as we are, eternal, beyond the limitations of linear existence. Is this not what all parents desire for their children? Transcendence?" Sarah could see Ethan more clearly now. His physical form was becoming increasingly unstable, flickering between solid matter and pure energy. But his eyes, his beautiful brown eyes, still held traces of the child she knew. "Ethan, look at me," she shouted. "Really look at me." For a moment, the boy's gaze focused on her face. The ancient intelligence flickered, and she saw confusion, fear, and recognition.
"Mom."
His voice was barely a whisper, but it was his voice, not the harmonic chorus he'd been channeling. I can't stop them. They're so lonely, and they promise it won't hurt, but I'm scared. I'm so scared." "I know, baby. I know." Sarah reached out, her hand passing through what remained of his physical form. "But you have to choose. They can't take you unless you let them. You have to choose what you want to be." The architect's response was immediate and overwhelming. The tear in reality widened, and more beings began to emerge. The very air around them began to crystallize, taking on the geometric patterns of their home dimension. He has already chosen. The pattern is complete. The bridge will not be severed. But Sarah had seen something in her son's eyes, a flicker of the stubborn, independent boy who had always insisted on making his own decisions. "Ethan, remember when you were 5, and you wanted to paint your room black? Remember what I told you?" Through the dimensional distortion, she saw him smile. You said it was my room, and I could choose any color I wanted. But you also said I had to live with that choice." "That's right. And this is your choice too. Not theirs, yours. What do you want to live with? The architect's collective consciousness pressed against them both, offering visions of existence beyond time and space, of knowledge spanning galaxies, of power beyond human comprehension. But Sarah also saw what they didn't want Ethan to see: the emptiness, the endless isolation, the complete separation from everything that made him human. "I want to come home," Ethan whispered. "I want to be your son, not their bridge." The moment he made his choice, the connection wavered. The stone's glow flickered, and the tear in reality began to contract. The architect's collective scream of rage and loss shook the foundations of the house.
Now!
Sarah grabbed for Ethan's hand, and though it was barely substantial, she felt their connection, not quantum entanglement, but something far more powerful. The love between a mother and her child. The energy field collapsed, the stones went dark, and the tear in reality sealed itself with a sound like the universe sighing. Ethan's solid form returned all at once, and he collapsed into Sarah's arms, fully human and completely exhausted. Above them, the stars returned to their proper positions, and the night became ordinary once again. 3 months later, Sarah stood in her backyard watching Ethan play with his soccer ball. The morning was crisp and clear, with no trace of the otherworldly events that had transformed their lives. The 7 stones had been removed by the government team, though Professor Vasquez had warned that the dimensional scar left by the breach would take years to fully heal.
How is he?
Dr. Chen asked, joining Sarah on the back porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Better," Sarah replied, accepting the warm mug gratefully. "He still has nightmares sometimes, but they're getting less frequent." And he started talking about normal 8-year-old things again: video games, friends at school, whether he can get a dog.
And the voices? Gone.
He said they stopped the moment he chose to come home. Sarah took a sip of coffee, watching her son kick the ball against the fence. "Dr. Chin, do you think they'll come back?" "The architects." "I don't know," the psychiatrist admitted. "But I think Ethan proved something important that night. Even beings that exist in 11 dimensions can't force a human soul to surrender itself. Choice, real choice, is more powerful than any alien intelligence." Detective Kowalski emerged from the house, having finished his monthly check-in. The official report had classified the incident as unexplained atmospheric phenomena, but those who had witnessed it knew the truth. "Any unusual activity?" Sarah asked. "Nothing," Kowalski replied. "But Professor Vasquez wanted me to tell you that she's been monitoring dimensional stability worldwide. Whatever your son did, it seems to have created a kind of barrier. No similar incidents have been reported anywhere." Ethan ran up to them, grass-stained and grinning. "Mom, can we have lunch outside today?"
It's such a nice day.
Sarah looked at her son, really looked at him. His eyes were bright and clear, focused on the present rather than on invisible patterns in the air. His feet were firmly planted on the ground, and when he spoke, his voice carried no harmonic undertones. "Of course, sweetheart. But shoes this time. I don't want you getting splinters." As they prepared lunch together, Sarah reflected on how much had changed. The custody battle with Marcus had been resolved amicably. The shared trauma had somehow reminded them both of what was truly important. The neighborhood had slowly returned to normal, though a few residents still glanced nervously at the Mitchells' backyard when they walked by. But the most important change was in Ethan himself. The boy who had once stood barefoot in the dawn, listening to voices from another dimension, had chosen to be fully human. And in making that choice, he had discovered something the architects, for all their vast intelligence, could never understand: that being ordinary, being bounded by time and space and physical limitations, was not a weakness to be transcended but a gift to be cherished. "Mom," Ethan said as they set up their picnic blanket, "do you think the architects were really evil?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think they were lonely. And sometimes, when we're very lonely, we can't see how our actions affect others. They thought they were offering you something wonderful, but they couldn't understand that what makes you wonderful is exactly what you already are." Ethan nodded solemnly, then brightened. I'm glad I stayed. I like being me.
So do I, Sarah said, pulling him close. So do I.
As they ate their lunch in the ordinary suburban backyard, under the normal blue sky, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The strange rocks were gone, the voices were silent, and her son was home. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, grounded in the simple, powerful reality of human love. And if somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, ancient beings mourned their lost opportunity, that was a sadness that belonged to them alone. Here, in this moment, in this reality, a mother and her son had chosen the extraordinary gift of being ordinary. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting familiar shadows across the yard where mystery had once bloomed. But now there were only the shadows of a family at peace, in a world where the impossible had touched the mundane and been gently, firmly sent away.